welcome to another episode of Pioneering Pensions. For you who don't know me, my name is Stefan Lundberg and I have a passion for pensions. Today, we're going to dig a bit deeper into the auto-enrollment reform in Ireland. And our guest today is Jerry Moriarty, and he is the CEO of the Irish Association of Pension Funds. But before we dig into the content, I just wanted to say that the purpose with Pioneering Pension is to bring experts together. We're going to think about interesting topics. We're talking to academics, we're talking to politicians, policymakers, and we're talking to practitioners. And today we're going to discuss a very interesting topic, which is auto-enrollment and the reforms in Ireland. And I think a lot of people of you have been thinking about pension reforms across the globe. And this is a good opportunity to learn more about a reform in the making. With that, I would like to introduce Jerry Moriarty here to Pioneering Pension. So welcome, Jerry.
Thank you, Stefan.
And we've known each other for, I think, more than 10 to 15 years. I met you in one of the Pension Europe's events, and I think we've been discussing pensions a bit on and off since then. So this is really nice to have you here, Jerry.
Yeah, I'm really good to be here. Yeah, it's a topic I'm particularly interested in, so it's great to be able to share some of the thoughts on it.
Jerry is not the one who designed this. It's been done at the Irish government. But Jerry is knowing the industry inside and out, and he knows about reform, and he can also think about what will the consequences be and how will it be implemented. So with that sort of caveat, I will ask your first question to you, Jerry, and that is, this has been around, this auto-enrollment project in Ireland for many, many years, and we've seen different sort of shapes and ideas of how it should look like. So can you give us an update on the current status and where is today and roughly sort of how it got there?
Yeah, you're right. It has been around for a long time, and there's been a lot of discussion in Ireland over the last 20 plus years about how to increase the number of people who are saving for retirement. It's sort of been static at around 50% of the workforce, and tends to be very heavily biased towards people who work in large employers, people who work in the public sector. And obviously with an aging population, it's important that you get more people to save for retirement, particularly when you've got a first pillar pension that is really designed just to keep people out of basic poverty. So there's been discussions on auto-enrollment or even some form of mandatory pensions. There's been a lot of analysis done, a huge amount of research. And it's only in recent years that it's really got some of the political momentum behind it to move it forward. We had the publication of a sort of straw man for auto-enrollment, which was a model that was put out for consultation to see what people felt in 2018. At the time, it was planned to introduce it in 2022. That stalled partially because of COVID. And we then had the design principles, the final design principles published last year. We've now seen the sort of outline of the legislation that's been debated at a parliamentary committee recently. The intention is that legislation would be passed later this year, and that we'll actually see the introduction and the start of auto-enrollment at some stage next year, probably quarter 3 of 2024. So it has been around a long time, but it does seem to be moving forward in a way now where we're starting to talk about start dates.
Well, that's good news. And since the workplace pension is basically a top up of the state pension, and maybe not everybody here in the call is aware of the Irish system, can you just give us sort of the elevator explanation of the state pension so we know where we're starting from?
Yeah, and I guess like most state pensions, the Irish state pension is it's a little bit complicated. So I'll just give you the highlights if you like. The maximum amount payable is €265.30 a week, so that's 13,700 a year. Like I said, that is designed to keep people out of poverty. It's not really designed to give most people the replacement income they would like. It is dependent on payment of sufficient social contributions. Social insurance contributions over your working lifetime. I won't get into the complications around those, but that has changed from, there was a time you could get your full state pension if you just paid for the last 10 years before retirement. That's now changing to basically paying over 40 years of a working lifetime. State pensions payable currently at age 66. There was a plan to increase that to 67 in 2021 and then 68 in 2028. But the whole issue of rising retirement age became a really big issue during our last general election, which was in 2020. And basically, all political parties pretty much promised to either reduce the state pension age or to stall it, which goes down very well with the electorate, but isn't realistic in terms of sustainability of the state pension going into the future. Particularly, we've still got a relatively young population, but it does age quite quickly over the next 20, 30 years. It's pretty clear at this stage it's not going to move from age 66 anytime soon. But the government, in fairness, have also been quite clear that that is going to have to mean increased state insurance or social insurance contributions. And currently, there's an actuarial review being carried out to figure out, what they will be and how they will apply to employees and employers.
Well, it sounds like the complication sounds like most countries, and I think it's a good thing that you have to increase the contribution so people see it's not money coming from nowhere. For our AE reform, I understood that is sort of an opt-out version, pretty much like in the UK. So how do you opt out?
Yeah, so basically, once you're auto-enrolled, you have to stay in the system for 6 months. You will have an opportunity to opt out then in month 7 or month 8. And if you don't do that, you stay in. If you do opt out, you get auto-enrolled in 2 years. And I think the rationale behind that is obviously playing a little bit on the inertia effect, where once people are in, they tend to not go to the bother of opting out. But also, I think the rationale behind the 6 months is so people can actually see what the impact of savings over 6 months can get you. And particularly where the employer contributions are going to be the same as the employee contributions, and then there's an additional top up from the state. So that hopefully people will see for, relative to their contribution, there's actually quite a lot in their account after 6 months.
And how much do you contribute into the system?
Yeah, so the contribution is going to be phased in over 10 years. Ultimately, after 10 years, it will be 6% for employees, 6% for the employer, and then a 2% state contribution. That's a direct contribution instead of tax relief. Contributions are also going to be based on your gross earnings. So it's not on a band of earnings, it's on everything you earn up to 80,000 a year. Just from the phasing in, year one or day one, it will start at 1.5% for employees, 1.5% for employers, 0.5% for the state. And then that will rise by the same amounts after every 3 years. So starting year 4, it'll be 3, 3, and 1. And then it'll go to 4.5, 4.5, 1.5, and then ultimately 6, 6, and 2.
So you just said that in the election, people say, well, stop increasing retirement age. Do you think there will be like a political pressure here also to slow down the increase?
I think it is one of the dangers. We've seen in Australia where there was, long-term stalling of of their contribution sort of schedule. It's always the danger with these things that the economic conditions are not right at the time. And sometimes, there is a sense too that I'm not sure the economic conditions are ever right, because I've heard arguments when the economy is doing really well, you don't want to do anything that might unbalance that. And obviously, when the economy is not doing well, people are suffering, so you can't make them suffer more. So I think it's important that there is a discipline about, if a lot of work has gone into working out that 6, 6, and 2 will get most people an adequate pension. Therefore, it's important we get to that and not stall it somewhere along the line.
Yeah, I think it's important for all politicians to actually explain it as well, because people understand it when you explain it to them, but it has to be done and people have to stand up. The politician has to stand up for the system they're designing. So hopefully that will happen in Ireland. I was thinking also now, what you say, you have a system, you have a relatively straightforward state pension, and there's an auto-enrollment reform coming in. So how is it going to be implemented? As we all know, the devil is in the details. So it would be good if you can give us a sort of heads up on the implementation. And I'm looking from a more practical perspective.
Yeah, so one of the interesting things they're doing is trying to take a lot of the work that normally falls to employers and centralizing that through a state agency, which is going to be the Central Processing Authority. So it will be the state, it will be that CPA that will have the responsibility for enrolling people, for identifying the population. Slightly different maybe to the UK, where that burden fell on employers at the beginning. And the agents or the authority will basically utilize revenue data, which, where basically revenue are getting real-time payment data to identify people who don't have pension contributions being made for them or are making pension contributions themselves. They will then notify employers that they need to make a payroll deduction for those people, and they will then effectively collect the money off them. So a lot of the burden has been taken away for employers. And again, some of the rationale behind that is because what we're dealing with here, so we're looking at a population of somewhere around 800,000 people. The vast majority of those work for very small employers, with maybe 5 or 6 employees that don't necessarily have a HR function. They do tend to have a sort of payroll function that's probably outsourced. So it's sort of using that combined with revenue data to make it as straightforward as possible for employers.
Well, that sounds good. And on the investment side?
Yeah, so then basically the Central Processing Authority will also, they'll do the basic administration in the same way any other pension scheme would be administered. They will collect the data, they will arrange for investment of the assets. Plan is that they're going to tender for investment managers, possibly up to 4 different managers. Each manager will have to have a default strategy. And like most auto-enrollment systems, the idea is that while people will have choice, they don't necessarily ever have to make a choice if they feel they're not able to or don't want to. So choices will be made for them. Default strategy, they talk about that being lifestyled in some way. Not clear exactly what that means. We'll probably talk about post-retirement later because it probably fits in with that. But also they will have effectively a low risk, a medium risk, and a high risk fund, a higher risk fund available as well. And also to prevent people, being winners or losers, depending which investment manager they end up with, particularly if they're not making choices. They're going to blend the funds. So effectively, if I choose either, if I end up in the default or if I end up in one of the other, say high risk fund, for example, a quarter of my contributions will go to each investment manager. So I'm getting the benefits of the returns of all of them rather than, trying to get lucky with one or the other.
I assume also that's part of getting a good deal for all investment managers because you can guarantee a flow, right?
Yes, and the plan on this system as well is that the maximum charge to members will be 50 basis points. And that includes the investment and the cost of running the Central Processing Authority. Now, in fairness, one thing that does strike me, that makes it a little bit difficult for the investment managers because they've obviously got no control over the costs or fees of the processing authority. But at the same time, the projections are this will become a relatively big fund over a short period of time. So it is something that should be of interest to investment managers.
And also, if you look at, for example, in the UK, auto-enrollment seems to be around 30 basis points. So there's definitely scope there. I was thinking going back into this administration unit, because that's a big difference. It gets me to think about if you're going to have one state agency who's going to run it, and the collection of capital is, or contribution are done centrally through the tax authority. I was thinking this sounds pretty much like the ATP system in Denmark or the PPM system in Sweden. Can you give us a bit more insight in how you think this is going to work?
Yes, it is. And interestingly, some of the people who were advising the department on the design of the system would have come from Scandinavian countries. And I know they spent a lot of time looking at those models. And as well as trying to limit the burden on a lot of small employers, it was also, I think, having recognition of the fact that if you centralize it, then you get away from the problem that many countries have encountered of having lots of people with small pots of money, because every time they move employer, they need to go into whoever that employer's provider is. Whereas in this case, because it's based around the employee, if someone moves employer, it doesn't matter. They just stay in the same system. The employer just gets a notification that they need to make a deduction for that person, assuming that employer doesn't have an alternative pension plan. So it kind of makes sure you've got portfolio members from the start. So I think that's quite an important feature as well. It is intended that this will be a body that will be set up under legislation. It will be separate from the department. It will be sort of standalone state agency. There's been a little bit of discussion about how that then gets regulated, whether it's an IARC or whether it's a master trust or both. It certainly has a lot of similar features to that, but I don't think that's been finalized yet.
Yeah, and I think in Sweden, the Premium Pensions Authority, they seem to do a good job there informing members. But you can also think of an argument for the other side is to say, well, if it becomes a monopoly, there's also a risk that it become a bit tired and won't sort of stay ahead of the curve, and you feel you get less sort of service than you would get if you have a lot of smaller competing firms. So, and also might be difficult to recruit if this agency is not able to pay industry salary to people. Well, has that been part of the discussion?
I think it's certainly come up as one of the concerns. I think having it as a separate state-alone state agency probably means you're less tied to public sector salary limits, for example. So I think it probably gets away from that. It is something that could be retendered again. So, the idea is that they will tender out for somebody to run that. That in itself adds a bit of competition. I think there's some benefits in, starting afresh. They say in the design documents that this is going to be designed for digital. So it's not like you're trying to add digital capability onto existing systems. So I think that would be good, because I think they do want a lot of systems to work around, employees and members having apps and not having to deal with paperwork and things like that. And I think that would be very welcome.
In theory, it sounds brilliant. And I know from practice that it's not that easy. And so you're basically saying they're going to procure a pension admin provider, and you're going to procure investment asset manager, and the entity in the middle is the one who's going to tie everything up. What is the timetable for this?
Yeah, so the legislation is planned to go through Parliament in the second half of this year. So I think originally they'd hoped to get the legislation through before the summer recess, but it looks like that's not going to happen. Part of the legislation involves setting up the legal structure. It will have a board that will oversee the running of the organisation. And I think the intention is that board would be made up of possibly union employee representatives, and obviously people with good pensions knowledge as well. The intention is the procurement for the administrator has actually been issued. That was issued about 2 weeks ago. It's intended to hopefully have that in place by September, and then issue the tender for the investment management piece before the end of the year as well. And then looking to auto-enroll the first people in Q3 of next year. Obviously, there's a huge amount to be done, so I think that timetable it's very ambitious.
Yeah, I fully agree with you. Knowing what I know from this, it's easy to be ambitious, but when the IT project, it has to work, and it's for everyone. 800,000 people. You need to have it working from day one. Otherwise, you're going to have a lot of disappointment and people being upset with the system.
Absolutely. And, auto-enrollment systems do rely on people trusting the system and have a good experience with it. Otherwise, people will just opt out, albeit it's not that easy to opt out, but still the opportunity is there. So I think it is important that they get that right from day one. At the same time, because it's been discussed for so long and under review for so long, I think it's, I prefer people who are ambitious. And I think people will be realistic as well and know the importance of getting it right from the start.
Yeah. Let's turn to the retirement phase, because you save to something, right? You save to your retirement. So the question is, how is that going to be implemented? And our last guest, Catherine Riley, she had a question for you actually on this, but instead of me repeating that question, let's roll the tape.
In Ireland, you're in the enviable position of designing a new pension system, and you have a lot of examples to look at. And I think one area where all the current DC systems fail is in integrating the post-retirement phase. So my question for you would be, what can you in Ireland do to learn from the mistakes of the US, the UK, Australia, and build something that will also carry people seamlessly into retirement and provide them with good quality income during the post-retirement period?
It's a really good question. And it's actually something I discussed with Catherine when I met her in Boston a few years ago. I wish I could say we have an answer, but we don't at the moment. That doesn't mean it's not being thought about. It just means that in the design of the system, it's not seen as an absolute need for day one. The reason behind that is people are going to be auto-enrolled between the ages of 23 and 60. You can only retire at state pension age, which, as I said earlier, is 66. Therefore, the first people are not going to be retiring until 6 years after introduction. And those people who've had 3 years of savings of total of 4.5%, sorry, 3.5%, and then 6 years where that's gone up. But I think the department want to concentrate on get the system up and running, and then take some time to think about what the retirement is going to be. They have been quite clear that they want a solution that comes from within the system. So people, like I said earlier, people don't have to make a choice. There will be choices available. And they're very conscious that people can go through their entire life in auto-enrollment without ever having made a choice. And you don't really want to force choices on those people when it comes to retirement age, because those are quite difficult. At the moment in Ireland, you can either use your funds, you can take tax-free cash, you can then use the remainder to purchase annuity, or you can transfer to a drawdown product where you can continue to invest and then draw down as you need. But I think the system will ultimately have some sort of drawdown facility within it. And I know they're also conscious that, particularly in the US, you're starting to see the creation of some solutions that have a blend of flexibility, continued investment post-retirement, but also addressing the sort of longevity issue by having some sort of, whether it's longevity insurance or a deferred annuity or a deferral of annuity purchase, so that actually when people get to a certain age that they have an annuity either kicks in, or you've got almost a predetermined purchase of something, so that, when people might find it hard to make decisions as well, for cognitive reasons, that there's some sort of insurance built in. So I think they're keen to see how that develops. My understanding is they've been done for specific organizations. They've been quite hard to put together. And if you can get those to become more mainstream, I think that's something they would look at quite closely.
Yeah, and if you do have one agency who do run the administration and the choice architecture in the savings phase, they are probably going to be the one developing the solution for the drawdown. And I think there's a lot of things being thought about around the world, so they should be able to get a lot of good input. When you look at different countries, so when you come to retirement, there are actually different ways how you're going to deal with it. In the UK, you can take your money basically 10 years before the state pension age, and then as cash and do whatever you want with it. In Netherlands, you basically have to buy a lifelong annuity, a variable annuity. So you have to pool your individual longevity risk according to the law. What is the thought in Ireland? Is it sort of are they gonna change the current legislation to make it some more like the Dutch one or more like the UK one? Or what do you see for the future when it comes to retirement and the legislation and the taxing around the money?
Yeah, I think certainly auto-enrollment is designed, you can only take the benefits of state pension age, so there's no opportunity to take early retirement. There may be some in ill health or very narrow specific reasons. I think there's probably becoming more of a focus on a pension being a pension. And I think when you look at what most people really do need in retirement or want in retirement, it's a sort of steady income payable for life. But I think there are also opportunities in continuing to invest post-retirement, because the investment horizon for so many people now is much longer than it would have been because of improved life expectancy. And also you reach retirement, you've probably got the most funds you've ever had accumulated. So you can really benefit from continuing to invest post-retirement. So I think some sort of mixture of continual investment, but like I said, that piece of longevity protection as well. There is an interesting paper from the Pensions Council which advises the Minister recently, because there is quite a lot of focus on tax-free cash. DC systems, you can pretty much take 25% of your fund as tax-free cash, and everybody does because it's tax-free. But quite often then people just invest that by sticking it in a bank account. Well, don't invest it, but they save it by putting it in a bank account so they've got easy access, and lose a lot of value, particularly with inflation as it is at the moment. And one of the suggestions of the Pensions Council is that, where you're encouraging people to invest post-retirement, they can actually defer, if you like, the payment of their tax-free cash over their lifetime. So every time they make a withdrawal, 25% of it is tax-free. So you're encouraging investment post-retirement, and you're not encouraging people to take large sums of money out at the point of retirement purely because there's a tax benefit to doing so. So I think there will be a lot more focus on a pension being a pension and providing an income.
That's very good. And I think it's really important to stress that you need to take investment risk also in retirement, but it's a different investment problem to solve than the accumulation. But we had a lot of episodes here in Pioneering Pension where we talked about tontines, and I think that's a good way to understand you can separate your investment risk from your longevity pooling, and therefore actually find something that's going to work for people in a good way. I would think I'm going to ask a final question before I open it up now to questions from the audience. And I mean, you've been through this very lengthy process, and what are the lessons you think other countries can learn from Ireland who are thinking about introducing auto-enrollment or making sort of a more thoughtful reform of the pension system?
I think there is a danger of over-analysis, I think, and sometimes you just do have to get on and make tough decisions. I think we all know politically pensions are quite a difficult issue, because you're basically asking people to make sacrifices now that they're not going to see the benefit of in the future. And that can be a difficult message for politicians to sell. So, if you look at the example of state pension age, even though everybody knew it doesn't make sense to stall the rise in state pension age, and there are good reasons for it, it becomes a much easier message to sell, particularly at election time. And it's a very brave politician who can stand up and say, actually, this sounds great, but it's not a free lunch, and we have to take tough action on this. There are other things at play as well, which I think in raising state pension age, it's not always straightforward. You do need to have mechanisms for people who maybe started work much earlier than other people, or worked in very hard labor. It's not that easy for everybody to just keep working forever. But I think there needs to be an honesty about it, and you need to then get up and sell that message. So I think it's not over analyzing, get on and do it, and try and build in some flexibility to, things will need to be improved, things will need to be changed to be able to do that as well.
I think the last thing you said is really important, because I saw up in Sweden, they did a reform back in the mid-90s, and the pension group has sort of managed that one, but it's actually been difficult for them to sort of agree on maintenance of the system. But the world is moving on, and 20 years later, it's a complete different world. So you need your pension system also to grow and evolve with the society around it and the conditions. So I have a question here from John Mitchum, and he says, given that auto-enrollment DC savings have risen in both the US, Canada, Australia, Ireland, etc., is this model an American Anglo-Common Law phenomena, or do you think it will be exported to continental Europe? And since you're quite active in Pension Europe, I think it's a perfect question for you.
Yeah, it has started off that way. I think it is becoming more prevalent in other countries. Certainly some of the Central Eastern European countries have models that are not dissimilar. If you look at the direction of travel for the Dutch system, it's heading in that direction. Although I do think the difference is, we have been more focus, and it probably changes a little bit as you get towards more consolidation, more master trust. The type of Irish model is being proposed, where you're moving away from the purely individual accounts and moving towards something that's got more collective element to it. And that's where I think you can actually almost get a good blend of the different models, because, you know, it's certainly been proven that if you leave, you know, particularly investment decision making to individuals, they tend to make bad decisions at the wrong time. So, you know, taking some of that away and having more done collectively, I think is helpful.
And also a comment to that in many countries in Europe, you have quite high participation already in the pension system because they're collective agreements. So the need for auto-enrollment isn't really there because you have 90% of the workers already in a pension scheme. And I think the value of auto-enrollment is to get people in, to start saving for pension. Yorick has a question here as well, going back to the contribution, and maybe you answered that because he typed it perhaps before you talked about it, but he said, is there a set percentage for contributions, like percentage of gross wages? Is there division between employer and employees, and is there contribution matching in place? So the question is it gross? I think is important to bring up because we didn't discuss that. And also, is this sort of, do employers, can they offer more than this, or do you think they will?
Yeah, so the plan is it is on gross earnings, and after 10 years it will be 6% employee contribution, 6% employer, and 2% direct contribution from the state. So it'll be 14% of gross earnings up to a max of 80,000 a year. Can employers offer more? It's not envisaged at the moment that people can pay additional amounts in, but again, it's something the department have said they will look at in the future. Whether that's employees or employers. I think they want to make it as straightforward and simple at the start. And I think also you're dealing here with people who don't currently have any pensions in place. So, you know, adding additional features is probably not a priority for them because this is going to be the first time they're making any pension contributions for most people.
Very good. And we have a question from Colm. He says, the minister has asked the Pension Council to assess whether a smooth approach to investments would give rise to big reductions in the contribution rate. What does the IAPF think about that proposal?
Yeah, so there has been a specific proposal that I'm not going to get into detail because it's quite complex, but effectively that the nature of auto-enrollment, because everybody's in the system, people continue in the system post-retirement, that actually you can make significant savings either in the contribution levels or, you know, significantly increase the returns by just investing the assets 100% in equities and smooth the returns over the lifetime of the participants. Because people can't take their money out, so you don't get any kind of you know, bias choosing against the system. It's an interesting proposal, and the author of the proposal has asked that the minister or that somebody should examine it in more detail, just to see if it does work. There's a lot of analysis behind it, which would indicate it does. The minister has asked the Pensions Council, which is an advisory body, to look at that, and certainly something I think that's a really good idea, because, you know, if there is something out there that works, great. But I'm conscious as well, it's you know, it's not something that's been done anywhere else, and yeah, it deserves further analysis, I think.
I would be a bit careful with that kind of approach because you have to smooth it against an average or something, and that might not be the average that you're going to see in reality. So you might have a situation where you be too generous in your smoothing, and reality is a bit harsher, and then you're going to have a point in time where you have to reconsolidate your sort of your smoothing with reality, and that's always going to be a very painful moment. I think that's what the Dutch experience with their challenges. So
yeah, and
thoughts on that? I mean,
yeah, absolutely, and I think it also relies on, it's fine as long as you've got a steady population joining auto-enrollment all the time. Obviously, if at some stage in the future, a future government decided that for some reason we're not going to do this anymore, then you might have issues as well. But yeah, but those are the type of issues that need to be examined, I think, around it.
And I think there is my advice would be look around in the world, because a lot of this stuff has been tried. And so you can see what works and don't work, actually. So that's the good thing. We're looking at many different countries. You can actually, some ideas seems good on paper, and then you can see how did it work in practice, because the devil is always in the details.
Exactly.
We have a question from Nick here. Do you think current providers are likely to expand their coverage? In other words, by encouraging an employer's lower paid employees to join an existing scheme, or more likely to encourage all lower earners to join the Central Processing Authority?
Yeah, I think that's an interesting one for current employers who've got voluntary pension plans, because if you don't have all your employees in your own pension plan, you've got a decision to make around whether, these are people who have obviously chosen not to join. They will be auto-enrolled because there aren't pension contributions being made for them. You may prefer to deal with everything within your own plan rather than having contributions going off somewhere else and having employees confused about who they're getting communication from. But there is an issue then, which I think what the question is getting to a little bit, about people who are, for example, not paying tax around standard rate tax in Ireland would be better off in auto-enrollment, because the contribution they're getting from the state would be better than the tax relief they would get. Whereas people who are paying high rates tax are better off under tax relief. That may be an issue for employers as to what you do, but it kind of remains to be seen how that works out. At some stage, in order to be equivalent to auto-enrollment, existing pension plans are probably going to have to change anyway, because most currently don't base contributions on gross earnings, for example. They normally do it on basic earnings and would exclude things like bonuses or kind of fluctuating payments. So there will be a little bit of work to do further down the line for existing employer plans. And you may find at some increase, there will certainly be more flexibility under an existing employer plan, particularly around things like when you can retire. You're not limited to state pension age. You can take early retirement. You can pay additional contributions. So there might be benefits for existing plans. And just sort of obviously at a more general level, you're going to have a lot more people paying into pension plans anyway, which is good for everybody.
So basically here, if you're in the out enrollment, you're paying for the first euro you earn goes in there, or do you have like a cap as well before you can start contributing?
Yeah, so if people who will be auto-enrolled, the age criteria is over age 23, under age 60, and you have to be earning more than €20,000 a year. But once you're auto-enrolled, the contributions are then based on your total earnings. So if you're earning €20,001, you pay 6% of €20,001.
Okay, perfect. Because in the UK, they have slightly different rules on this.
Yes, and it's one of the areas that there's been a lot of focus on around the eligibility rules. So a lot of people, trade unions particularly, feel 23 is too high, that you should be capturing people when they join the workforce. The department would say that 75% of people under the age of 23 who are working are mainly students doing part-time weekend work or summer work. Although I would have thought that €20,000 kind of takes those out anyway. They're probably not earning that. There's also been a lot of focus on the 20,000 in that obviously you're excluding lower paid workers who earn less than that, and they tend to be predominantly women, so you're not helping address the gender wage gap. I think that the department's concern is, 6% of gross earnings from somebody who's not earning a lot might put them under a lot of pressure, on a day-to-day basis. And that actually having a state pension that's close to 14,000 a year gives those people a good replacement income. But it is possible that there might be some movement on either the 20,000 or the age 23 when we see, the final legislation. Albeit the department would stress as well that anybody can opt into auto-enrollment. So, even though you wouldn't be auto-enrolled, if you want to join, you can, and then your employer still has the full obligation to pay the contributions as well.
Okay, so it's to make it a bit simpler. I was wondering, in most countries, there's like one group of people who always fall outside these systems, and those are the self-employed, so to say. How does it work in Ireland and the self-employed?
Yeah, and it's going to be the same. I mean, they are focusing on people in employment, so you have to have an employer. They have said they do want to look at the self-employed, but again, it's just a layer of complexity that they feel isn't important from day one. A lot of self-employed people, they don't get paid on a regular basis. So how would you collect contributions? You don't have an employer piece. A lot of people really reinvest a lot of the money from their company in the early years, and then it's only in the later years that they really have money to save for retirement. So I think there are just too many issues for day one, but they have said they do want to think about how they might have something for those workers, those people as well.
Yeah, because I remember when they talk about the Chile experience, the idea of the World Bank was that Chile would be looking more like Europe, while in reality Europe started to become looking more like Chile with more self-employed. So I think there's it's a difficult problem. The only one I've seen done something intelligent about it is Iceland, but that's like a country of 350,000 people, so it's probably doable.
Yeah.
We have a question here from Colm. The 1 in 3 top-up is equivalent to a 25% tax relief. For 40% taxpayers, this is greatly inferior to the current pension schemes. Any comments?
Yeah, no, it is. And I think that is one of the concerns we would have, in that adding that sort of additional complexity to the overall pension scheme isn't helpful at a time when we've been trying to simplify the pension system in general. So, making people think about whether they should be in auto-enrollment or whether they should do something themselves. Now, you could argue as well that yes, it is inferior, but the people who are going to be auto-enrolled are not availing of any tax relief at the moment because they're not in a pension plan, and they're also not getting any employer contributions, which they will when they be auto-enrolled. So it's not quite as straightforward as just necessarily looking at the tax relief. But certainly it is an element to the system that I think is a little bit unhelpful.
Yeah, and I think I agree with you. And the more you can harmonize taxes across different part of the pension, it's always good, because it's difficult for everybody to get it, and that unnecessary complication, which means people are not so trustful in the system.
Yeah, and I think it's also going to be difficult to explain to people. So, for example, if you come back to somebody who's got an existing employer plan, one of their employees has joined it, one hasn't. The one who goes to auto enrollment will actually find that their pension deductions are much higher than the person who's in the existing employer plan, because the person in existing employer plan is getting tax relief, where they're paying 6% of their gross earnings and getting an additional top up from the state. So while their pension pot might be bigger, their actual salary is going to take a much bigger hit as well. So again, it just adds to that sort of confusion people are going to have around it.
But then you go back to your original statement. Well, get going, don't over theorize it, and maybe this is something we can deal later on. In the UK, who also did auto enrollment about 10 years ago, when you look at it, what would you say were the sort of, this was the stuff we really liked, so we stole it from the UK, and this is the stuff that we were thankful that the UK did, so we don't have to do it?
Yeah, and that's quite often the nature of Irish policy, is to look at what the UK did, and being a smaller country, you tend to do it later. So I think, The UK probably proved that auto enrolment works. That the opt-out levels are lower than anybody would have expected at the time of introduction. I think a lot of the research has shown that most people, while they would have never got around to starting a pension on their own, were sort of grateful that somebody did it for them. I know there are lots of other things, like the initial contribution levels are very low, so a lot of people probably didn't even realize they were making pension contributions. So you have to kind of take some of these things, you have to analyze them a bit further. But I think that worked really well. I think the Central Processing Authority almost borrows from Nest a little bit in terms of actually having one big sort of state, not operated, but state supported function. There's some merits to that. Things that didn't work, I think designing it to have somebody do the work that employers have to do in the UK, and also preventing lots of people having lots of small accounts. I think that was very high in the design and trying to make sure those issues could be addressed. So yeah, I think those are probably the kind of main things that come out.
One thing, it seems like the Central Processing Agency, is that a word, authority? Is that something people use? Because it sounds like, from a branding perspective, it sounds like something from the USSR.
Yes, I think the plan is to find a suitable name for auto enrolment along the lines of Nest or KiwiSaver or something. Yes, I certainly wouldn't recommend from a marketing point of view that you stick with Central Processing Authority. I'm not even sure authority. I mean, even agency sounds slightly better, but yeah, I'd imagine they will find something better to market it than that.
Well, I've seen a couple of these things going on. Once you get these sort of names floating around for a while, people get used to it.
Yeah.
So it is a bit of a danger, actually, setting something up. We have a question here from Akeem. He says, given the low level investment, is DC auto enrollment panacea to pension troubles? So basically, if you don't contribute enough, will it really solve the problem?
Yeah, and I think that is true, but I do think 14% of gross earnings is quite a lot. When you are augmenting what's a state pension that's not on a typical continental European level, that's meant to provide replacement income, but gives you a good base to keep you out of poverty. I think as auto enrollment systems go, I think that's relatively ambitious. So I'd be comfortable enough that the contribution levels are getting towards sufficiency and adequacy. Like I said earlier, though, the important thing is that you stick with the pathway to get there.
Yeah, and my comment on this is a bit like, well, you are where you are when it comes to DC. So, for example, in the UK, if people contribute 8%, and how do you get the most bang for that? Because you can talk to people and kind of convince them to contribute more, but that's not an easy task, because unless it's sort of integrated in sort of a more government plan where you have a minimum contribution, it might be difficult actually to convince people to save more. So the question for the industry to a large extent is, how can I get the maximum out of what the member got? And so that, I think, is an interesting challenge, particularly when you're looking at small pots of pension and low contributions. Is really a lifelong pension the optimal solution in that case? What do you think, Jerry?
Yeah, I mean, that's that's probably worth another hour. Yeah, I think having reasonable contribution rates is quite important, and I think it is. You can sweat a lot of time trying to optimize investment returns, looking at things like illiquid assets and how you integrate those into the DC schemes on a collective basis, and that can all really help, but if it's only adding a tiny amount to a tiny pot of money anyway, that's not really helping the person in retirement. So I think getting the contribution levels right has to be a good starting point. But then you can flip that on the other side and say as well, if it wasn't for auto-enrollment, most of these people would be saving nothing for retirement. So anything that they have at retirement is going to be probably better than the position they were in. So yeah, it's a very difficult one, but I think you have to try and work on both as much as you can, try and get the contribution levels right, but then also try and get as much as you can out of the investment piece as well.
And I think another thing which I'm thinking about when it comes to pension contribution, how do you set the right level? Because it's not easy, because you need to assume something about investment returns over the next 40 years. And what if you're wrong with that assumption? Well, you're going to end up either less or more money than you expected. You're very unlikely to end up exactly where you projected it to be. So it might be, if we do have low growth for the next 20 years, we need to contribute way more to get where we want it to be than if we do have high growth. And this is sort of, you only know it when you're there. So I find it really difficult to say this is a good level of contributions. What's your take on that, Jerry? Because it's so easy to fall in love with the model and assume the model is the truth, and then you end up making a lot of strategic or policy decision based on a model that might not work.
Yeah, and that's where I think you have to come back a little bit to the piece of conversation we were having earlier about just revisiting that all the time. You know, it's not like you set in place, you go away and come back in 40 years and have a look to see whether it worked out or not. I do think though as well, you know, the difficulty if you have, like you said, 10, 15, 20 years of low growth, and you really need to increase contributions, those are probably not the right economic conditions for encouraging people to increase contributions. But I do think revisiting it and just, you know, sense checking what your assumptions were and where they're going and how they're working out, I think that's important. You know, and it might be that 14% sounds like a reasonable amount now, but actually in 20 years time, it might seem actually people are saving too much. They're struggling on a day-to-day basis, and maybe we need to readjust, or the other way.
Yeah. And by the way, Nick has a comment here about, in the UK, before Nest was Nest, it was called Personal Accounts Delivery Authority. So that was equal.
True, I remember that, yes. Yeah, Nest is much better than PADA, yeah.
If there were two things you could sort of redo, say, to the people who made the new IE reform, what are the two things you would like to change?
I think I probably would relook at the sort of tax piece. Like I said, I know there is some logic for it. There's some sort of political element to it where I think politicians find it hard to stand over why somebody who's on a low salary is effectively getting nothing from the state and somebody who's in a high salary is getting a lot from the state. I think everybody ignores what happens to benefits when they come out the other side, where the person with the higher salary is paying a lot of tax on that, and the person who was not paying tax in the first place is not paying tax again. And that's the whole rationale behind tax relief. I think as well, I mean, if you want to get back to a very basic level, and certainly would have been my view, and it would have been the IAPF view as well, that actually, while auto-enrollment has a lot of really good features, there's a lot that you could do by just making it mandatory that would just make life a lot easier. You know, you save a lot in terms of compliance checking, try to figure out populations. But again, I think politically, it's sort of, people like the idea that they're not being forced into it, that they do have a choice. So, I mean, that came down to being a political issue, and I fully understand that. But I do think you make it a lot simpler if it's just mandatory rather than auto-enrollment. You know, you cut out a lot of time and admin in people opting out and being re-enrolled and suspending contributions or everything that goes with that. And
you could argue that you do that enrollment in the first place to reduce the pressure on the taxes in the future, because people have self-financed a lot of their pensions. You don't have to give them Social Security. So there could be an argument that way too. There's a last question from the audience here. Akeem, he says, can Ireland learn something from the Singapore Central Providence Fund?
I'm sure it can. And it's a while since I've looked at that fund, but one of the benefits of that fund, I think, is that it also provides a lot of other benefits. So it's not just about pension savings. And I do think there is something in that in terms of, one of the concerns of younger people particularly is going to be, I'm struggling as it is to purchase a property at some stage in the future, and now all my savings are going to be locked away in a pension plan till age 66. It's just how much you can do something like that where, you offer the ability of other savings without diluting the pension piece too much as well, and, trying to kind of stick to the original aim.
Now it's your time to ask a question to the next speaker. And the next speaker is Derek Dobson, and that's going to be on July 18 at 4 p.m. UK time. And Derek he's the CEO of the Canadian Colleges of Applied Art and Technology. And he is running a pension scheme, and he has got a lot of innovation and changing it and development. So we're going to talk about how do you do that in practice. So what would be your question to Derek?
Yeah, and I suppose it's it's almost a double question, but it's sort of linked, is that, how do you make sure when you're doing reform and innovation that it is actually proper reform and innovation rather than just tweaking what already is there? Because I think we're sort of very wedded to our starting point, and sometimes it's hard to take that step back to look at, okay, how can we do this completely differently if needs be? And linked to that then, how do you prevent perfection from becoming the enemy of the good? So how do you actually get on and implement something rather than just continually analyzing and trying to perfect it?
Thank you, Jared. That's a really good question for Derek. And with that, I would like to thank everyone in the audience who was here today and for your contribution, your questions. And I hope also we all learned something we can bring home and to improve pensions. And I also would like to thank you, Jerry, for coming here and sharing your insights and your knowledge about the Irish auto-enrollment.
No problem at all. It's been a pleasure.
Thank you, everyone. And I'm looking forward to see you on the 18th next month in the conversation with Derek. Until then, have a good summer.